Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Atlantis, the Lost Empire from 2001. This is the 41st Disney animated film, and I kind of find this period in Disney animation to be interesting because it seems like they were trying to do different things. The Renaissance was clearly over, and then Pixar came in, and obviously they weren't the great big cutting edge animation studio that they had been since, Mickey Mouse started with sound up until 1995. So they went through a bit of a kind of growing period where they're sort of trying to find themselves between basically Pocahontas and Tangled, where they kept trying out different sort of things. And I think in the early 2000s when they really went a little weirder with it, I guess. And this is their first of, I guess, two more action adventure-y films. There's no songs in this at all, except for like the credits or something, but no like musical number type songs you expect from a Disney film. And it's probably one of their first attempts to appeal to a different kind of audience since like Black Cauldron, really. A lot of it is very interesting. I don't necessarily think it's good, although I understand if people would be into it. And it kind of shows a time in feature animation when studios were willing to take risks on more action adventure stuff. This coming out almost literally exactly a year after Titan AE. I think Titan AE came out on like June 14th, 2000, and this comes out on June 15th, 2001. It's like literally like they were like, let's do the same weekend. This movie was a lot more successful than Titan AE, although it shares a lot of plot and story elements to such a point that I was actually a little shocked. I don't know if who ripped off who or something like that, although Michael J. Fox, who does the voice of the main character in this, was actually offered both, but then let his son pick, and his son picked this one. Atlantis, the Lost Empire, I think this and Treasure Planet have a similar thing where Disney clearly had been using fairy tales for a long time and taking these classic fairy tales that have been representing this kind of classic literature fairy tale thing that they've been doing for a while and adapting it. And clearly when they came to do adventure films, they decided, well, let's do the classical adventure films, but instead of, do them in a Disney way, which I guess in a lot of ways would have been more sense, but been a lot less interesting, made them in these kind of weird, interesting ways, and both in Treasure Planet's case and in this case. And I think in this case, they make a steampunk version of a Jules Verne story or an Edgar Rice Burroughs story. Obviously, they had done Edgar Rice Burroughs 2 years before with Tarzan, but that was more in the traditional Disney sense. Atlantis, the Lost Empire was different. It kind of does remind me of kind of the classic adventure stories, but they do it in more of like a 2000s kind of Star Warsy, 3-act kind of big blockbuster way, but also trying to be kind of true to those stories, but also true to big world building science fiction. And if you feel like that's probably maybe too many things to have in a usually shorter animated film, which is about 96 minutes, then you're absolutely right, because the original screenplay for this was 155 pages, and if you're watching this film, you can kind of tell that they kind of stuffed way too much into a film that doesn't really actually get to accomplish everything that maybe they would like it to, showing them being overly ambitious and maybe too much so probably for its own good. Milo Thatch has long wanted to do an expedition to find out where the lost city of Atlantis was. This was something his grandfather wanted as well, and he's supposed to do a big presentation for the people at the Smithsonian, I believe, and that kind of falls apart for various reasons because they think he's crazy, but then a benefactor who is a friend of his grandfather's and wanted to make right on his word to find Atlantis finds Milo Thatch, bankrolls kind of this crazy dig to the center of the earth type of expedition, gets together a group of people who are very trained in that sort of thing, and they go and gives him these journals that his grandfather had so they can find it, since Milo Thatch is able to read Atlantean. They go down and find Atlantis, but Atlantis is not what it once was. They're kind of dying and not exactly sure how to use the technology that made them the great amazing city of Atlantis, or so legend has told, and so they actually need Milo to help them discover what their technology was formerly like, because a lot of them can't actually read Atlantean, they can only speak it. So they're forced to kind of find out the situation, while also the people who took him down there want to steal this technology and get a huge reward for it, and they have to decide whether to save Atlantis or just sell out and sell Atlantis. If you're wondering with this film, like how would Disney bankroll something like this? Because it doesn't sound like them, and it doesn't entirely sound like something they would do even now. You know, it seems a little off the beaten path for them, like in extreme. So you have things like, you could say, yeah, but Big Hero 6 is different, what Wreck-It Ralph is different, things like that. But those are kind of within their own wheelhouse. This, design-wise, is different. This is a different kind of story than they normally do. And I think a lot of that had to do with the directors, who are Gary Truesdale and Kirk Wise, who had directed Hunchback of Notre Dame. And actually, one of the reasons they wanted to work on this and had the crew they did is because they liked the crew they worked on with Hunchback of Notre Dame. But more importantly, and what doesn't get mentioned a lot when people talk about this film, is these guys directed Beauty and the Beast. So Disney probably was cool with them experimenting and making their own weird movie. Now, the guys who directed Little Mermaid went on to do Treasure Planet and had a long history with the studio. These guys, their relationship seems to have soured. Also, they went to DreamWorks eventually. So neither of them have directed a feature film after this. This is it. They directed 3 animated feature films, and I have to say, you know, Beauty and the Beast being one of the all-time big Disney and great Disney films, I think they probably deserve a little bit more respect than we presently give them. I think this is probably their interesting, odd auteur kind of movie that live-action directors are often afforded, and big animation directors are rarely afforded, unfortunately. But I think it's actually kind of cool that they were willing to do this. Now, I think Disney should have stuck by them, and obviously around this era was the era of Emperor's New Groove and what happened in the documentary The Sweatbox, and that was the director of The Lion King, so I don't need to tell you that Disney doesn't have a great track record with trusting its animation directors, but I will say they went all in on this movie. They really completely supported it. Whether they supported them after this movie is a totally different topic, but basically they didn't. It doesn't sound like they actually really thought this was going to be huge. They changed like some submarine ride at Disneyland or World, or I don't know the Disney parks that well. I've never been to them, but they were actually going to make an attraction out of this. They were going to launch a TV series, which they didn't make, but used the 3 episodes that they had sort of done enough work on to make a direct-to-video sequel a couple years later in 2003 called Atlantis: Milo's Return. But they actually really did have a lot of faith in this, and they gave it a good slot in the summer, so it wasn't like they were trying to bury this or anything. I think this is kind of something that, like, you know, certainly Disney's such a marketing machine that making a film like this film was semi-profitable, but it wasn't a huge hit that they really needed, and a lot of these films post the Renaissance weren't as successful as Disney had previously been, and I think they really need those huge hits to get people to come to the theme parks and buy merchandise 20 years later, and Atlantis certainly did not become that. I like some of the ideas they have within it, but it feels like something that maybe should have been 120 minutes and not 96 minutes. It has a lot of cool twists and turns, it just doesn't have a lot of time to necessarily go into them, and although there are certain things that work better in animation, certain sequences, it did feel like they were trying to push all of this in to make kind of a more condensed story for an animated film and not necessarily letting the story breathe. It works a lot better than Titan AE, particularly the opening sequence. I was like, holy shit, I saw this in Titan AE and it automatically, the idea of the sequence bored me, but the animation was fucking amazing, and it shows like when Disney really puts their whole animation studio behind something, what they can really do with it. Which I think you can get mad at Disney and say they have all this talent, they have all this money, why don't they do something interesting? And it is sort of also interesting to note that often when they do, how many people talk about this movie or support it in any way. I do have to give them some credit for that. Apparently they had production t-shirts that says no songs, more explosions, because they really were trying to go after something different with this. They're particularly influenced with the character designs by Mike Mignola. Now, Mike Mignola, who made Hellboy and various comic book covers and comic books and stuff like that, was not aware of this, and nobody, like, you know, went to talk to him, although he was a production designer on this. And at one point when he was watching the film once it was done, he said, wow, the hands in this are really cool. And one of the animators sitting next to him said, well, funny story, we actually had a meeting on how to draw hands like you. And he was a little surprised. This is the one part of this film I don't get, because it seems like he was very surprised to learn that they were using his style, but he was a production designer on this, so why did they not go, hey, Mike Mignola, we're gonna make this feature film and use your character design kind of thing? could you come in and just explain this to us? Apparently they did not do that. I find that kind of odd because he's like in your office. I don't know. That just seems odd to me. It is kind of an interesting idea because Mike Mignola wasn't really as popular. I mean, he was popular. I'm not going to act like he was some obscure figure, but in a mainstream sense, I don't think many people knew that kind of design. It does feel like a different design. It feels a little more anime inspired, feels like that. And certainly Disney was sort of going towards that because they knew animation tastes were changing. And I think because they had been such a dominant animation studio, they often times try to rip off other ones to kind of stay with the times, but it doesn't feel like Disney, they can do things close to that, but it doesn't seem like they create anything as interesting as maybe the parts that influence them in those cases. And I think with Atlantis the Lost Empire, that's definitely true. It doesn't have the kind of fun pulpiness that I think a story like this should have. And you have this whole steampunk thing. It's often trying to be a little more modern while also trying to borrow from that. It does feel like they really went in and well researched and thought about this and thought like, oh, we're world building and we'll explain all this in the TV show and the sequel and things. Much like people tell you now with movies, don't think about the sequel, think about making one good movie. And I think the basic idea is like if someone wanted to remake Atlantis the Lost Empire, I don't think that'll ever happen, but if they did, you could actually flesh out a good movie or even a live action film if Disney gets desperate enough, which I don't think they will. But the whole idea of like their technology and what that could do to the world and everything like that, and kind of an alternate history kind of idea, but also like things certainly aren't explained or fleshed out enough. You don't understand like what the war was that Atlantis was having with someone like, I don't even know who those people were, and I imagine like in the TV show that would have been explained, or it wasn't a novelization or something. I know there was a war, and that's really all you need to know. Sometimes that works for it, sometimes it doesn't. I wish they could have done more explaining the city of Atlantis. I wish they could have done more dwelling on the idea that these people have lost their written language and don't understand it and understand how to read it, how they're very advanced but also sort of illiterate, which is sort of an interesting idea. But I also really love how they use the cast in this is really smart. I mean, they have Leonard Nimoy playing the chief or the king or whatever. Nimoy has such a kind of odd, kind of almost alien-like voice. It's probably why he could play Spock so well. I think that really works in this film as well. And everyone they have playing in Atlantean kind of has a kind of an odder, interesting kind of voice. And then you also have, Michael J. Fox, who at the time was doing a lot of more voice stuff. He did Stuart Little around this time too, and I think he's very good at playing that sort of protagonist. He comes off a little blander than I would have liked. I think everyone wants him to be Marty McFly in all these movies, and oftentimes I feel like we never get that kind of a performance out of him. I mean, look at the rest of his film career. I don't think anyone's like dying to talk about Doc Hollywood, and that's probably one of the more well-known ones that aren't Back to the Future, unfortunately. Obviously Teen Wolf, but I don't think he shines as well, but he is so good at doing that protagonist thing. It's like, Mark Hamill or something. I love how James Garner plays kind of a villain in this. I almost didn't accept it as James Garner. I thought it's somebody, well-known character actor or something, but it's James Garner. Like, I think that's cool, and he was really down to do it, and I really liked him in this. I wish he had played more villains. Hearing him in this, I thought he was like really, really good. This is also Jim Varney's last voice role, and unfortunately he didn't finish. He got close but didn't finish all of it. He was good in this as well, and the score by James Newton Howard gives it an interesting feel to the whole thing. I love some of the animation in this because it often feels it's Mike Mignola influence, but also feels French, particularly with the girl who went on the expedition with them, has this kind of French sort of feel. It's like an interesting way to design and do a Disney film. And I think these guys, clearly wanted to do something different and had gone to the heights that any animation director could ever do. At that time, they had a Best Picture nomination with Beauty and the Beast. They deserved to be able to make something like this. But I almost feel like this film is overly ambitious. It does kind of bite off more than it can chew, but it feels like these guys are ready to do on a more epic scale of a thing. This was an anamorphic aspect ratio. They really tried to make it like a big epic kind of David Lean thing. And I think they deserved it, but I think they maybe deserved a longer runtime. The original script was 155 pages, and I kind of feel like letting this film kind of dwell more in that and not going so quickly, it kind of hurt this film. Certainly I think this is a better made and better film than something like Titan AE. I think these have become like kind of staples of kids who grew up in that era, but I don't think they will grow much beyond that. And much of the reason is the weak storytelling within it. Now, this is a stronger told, weaker story, but it's still a weaker story. I actually kind of enjoyed the oddity that this film was, and it's definitely, I think, maybe a little better than a lot of American animation studios' attempts at doing an action-adventure animated film, but it still kind of just doesn't really sing the way all these cool influences are within it. I mean, this is like a steampunk, Jules Verne, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Atlantis, amazing, crazy story, and it should feel like that postmodern amalgamation kind of thing that Star Wars was in its time. I don't think this entirely worked. It kind of feels like a mixture. It makes you think that was interesting, makes you glad you saw it. You know, it had more CG than any Disney animated film at the time. I'm sure it was impressive if you saw it in the theaters, but in terms of like going beyond the interesting, I don't think Atlantis the Lost Empire really does. It just stays within that and is really good. It's just kind of an interesting kind of little piece of history that you can just sit in awe at and go, look what they tried. But I don't think it really gets much beyond that. And you know, there might be a larger conversation about how these directors should have been allowed to kind of do that and then move on, and Disney kind of work with them again, but clearly Disney was stupid enough to not do that, which I think is a shame. I hope these guys get to direct another film again. I think they really deserve it in terms of animation history, but also because I think they're damn good directors. And this does show like that, you know, they're willing to take on a different kind of animation style, a different kind of subject matter, a different kind of story. They might have failed doing it, but it's kind of like a valiant effort and a valiant attempt to kind of like mess with the Disney animation studio and have a studio believe in them, at least while it was coming out, is kind of an awesome, impressive, cool thing. And I think Atlantis the Lost Empire is an interesting watch, but because it's interesting. But interesting doesn't mean it's a good movie, it just means it's interesting. And it's interesting to think about that this film exists, but maybe it's not actually cool to watch its own existence. So if you have seen Atlantis the Lost Empire and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.